Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching TopTenzNet, and in the video today, the top 10 differences between Brits and Americans. In some ways, Americans and British people seem very similar at first glance. We look very similar, we wear similar clothes, we share the same language, and we certainly have some shared historical connections. However, beyond just the fact that we use a lot of different words to mean the same things, or all the accents you would have to get used to, there are also many cultural differences and quirks that would instill culture shock in anyone who decided to jump across from one side of the pond to the other without doing their research first. Number 10. British humour preferences are dry and indirect. American humour is very loud and in your face. British humour is very much different from American humour and often goes over the heads of the American audience. This isn't because Americans aren't intelligent enough to get the joke, but because Americans are not nearly as used to being subtle with their humour. A good example of British humour is Monty Python, who produced numerous memorable skits and full-length comedic movies. The British sense of humour tends to be very sarcastic, often using wordplay or cleverly insinuating things instead of saying them outright. It tends to be much less direct in general and often has a rather pessimistic bent. On the other hand, American humour tends to be very direct and very in your face. Americans like to tell jokes in such a way that you don't really have to think that hard and you generally know right away exactly what is supposed to be funny. Americans also tend to prefer very loud and boisterous humour, whereas British tend to be a lot quieter, even while telling jokes and having a laugh. Ricky Gervais has also commented that Americans tend to be a lot more positive in general, and especially with their comedy. For this reason, after the first season of American Office, Michael Scott became a much more affable guy who really just wanted to be liked by everyone. Number 9. Gun ownership is a huge difference that greatly affects the different cultures. One of the most common stereotypes about Americans abroad is that they really love guns. Europeans in general, but especially the British, we don't really understand why America has so many guns. While it may not be true that everyone owns a gun, and many people really do only carry them for self-defense, it is true that America has one of the highest rates of gun ownership in the world. You may hear some people advocating for stricter gun control laws, but there are only a tiny portion of people who would actually advocate banning guns altogether. Many people consider the Constitution to be practically sacred, and it gives Americans the right to keep and bear arms. Considering the history of violent revolution, Americans are pretty attached to that right. However, over in Great Britain, people simply do not own guns or walk around with them. Even the police in Britain don't have guns, which is something that often surprises tourists. Naturally, this means people have a much different relationship with the police. People tend not to fear them so much as they do in America because they're not going to be able to shoot them. Importantly, there is also a relationship of trust that they are able to build up because of the lack of guns. On the other hand, police in the United States basically have to keep guns around for protection and be prepared for the worst because any citizen they are dealing with could legally be packing heat. Number 8. Americans hate dynasties, whereas the British still love their royal family and its rich history. British people do not worship their royal leaders, and they're pretty fine with criticizing them if they feel it's needed or sharing gossip about them. However, most people do have a sense of respect for the office itself. People have a certain love for the Queen as well, and it's certainly deserved. She's been reigning for several decades and has avoided controversy almost the entire time, and also attended hundreds of engagements every year. However, Americans, on the other hand, simply don't abide by the idea of royalty. Indeed, it's the reason they struck out for America in the first place. For this reason, Americans tend to be very wary of anything that can be considered a political dynasty. That means that when you see another Bush or Clinton or Kennedy, people tend to groan and express their distaste for what they feel is harkening back to the days of royals, even if they would normally tend to vote for someone with that political belief. Now, Americans are not completely unreasonable. If that candidate turns out to be closest to their values, they will often still vote for them regardless, but it is with great reservation. Americans value having a feeling of freedom, and anything that seems like a political legacy reminds them of the days when they were under the control of a monarch. Number 7. Teeth in Britain aren't unhealthy, they just aren't as worried about straightening them or whitening them. The most common and ugly stereotype about British people that you see in American media is that the British have really horrible teeth. This is mocked especially hard in some of the early episodes of Family Guy, where British teeth are shown to be horrifically misshapen. This ugly stereotype has spread all over the internet and is hard to squash at this point, but maybe we'll try and squash it here anyway. The truth is that Americans tend to be a little bit obsessed, often driven by the media, to always look as perfect as possible. Americans tend to have straighter teeth because even lower middle class American parents Brits will go to great lengths to make sure their teens' teeth are perfectly straight. On the other hand, people in Great Britain tend to not be so worried about the cosmetic appearance of their teeth. While it is starting to catch on a bit as a trend as Britain is exposed to more American media, it's still not the norm to worry about having a perfectly white or straight smile. However, this doesn't mean that the British don't actually care about the health of their teeth. The idea that the teeth are bad or that there is anything wrong with them is indeed completely false. In fact, a recent study shows British people actually slightly edging out Americans when it comes to the overall health of their teeth. Americans are simply better at making their smile look shiny for the camera. Number 6. Eggs are left out unrefrigerated when sold in Great Britain, something that would greatly alarm Americans. One of the biggest culture shocks for an American visiting Great Britain or someone from Britain coming to visit America is how we store our eggs. British people, we store our eggs out in the open without any refrigeration, which would make Americans think that they were intentionally trying to spoil them. And in a way they would be right if the British processed the eggs the same way they're processed in America. In America, the natural coating known as the cuticle is removed while washing the eggs in order to ensure that any harmful bacterial buildup is removed. They are then kept refrigerated to avoid spoilage because they no longer have their coating to protect them. On the other hand, Britain and most European countries actually do not remove the cuticle when processing the egg. They believe that removing the natural layer makes it more porous and vulnerable to bacteria, so they prefer keeping the natural shell on and then washing it immediately before use. Because the natural coating is not removed, refrigeration is completely unnecessary and a waste of electricity. Now, there are pros and cons to both methods, and in their own way, both methods run the risk of causing salmonella outbreaks. No matter what country you live in, though, it would be a good idea to rinse off any egg before use and to make sure to cook it all the way through to the appropriate temperature. Number 5. More than half of households in the United Kingdom don't own clothes dryers. In the United States, nearly 80% of households own a dryer for their clothes to go with their washer, while in the UK, most people own a washer, but less than half of households actually use an electric clothes dryer. Of course, many Americans are now probably wondering, how do people dry so many clothes? And the answer is they still hang the clothes out to dry. Indeed, this can actually be quite energy efficient, and while it may rain a lot in Great Britain, the weather is usually not particularly intemperate. On the other hand, in the United States, almost no one hangs their clothes out to dry anymore. Indeed, in many cases, it is considered so much against social norms in the United States that you might get some pretty weird looks for it. And while many in Britain don't use dryers to save on energy costs, many Americans know that it is one of the 2 highest energy sinks in their home, but they continue to use it anyway. It is indeed very much a part of the fabric of American life, and most people would not be caught without one. Even the few people who don't own one just tend to take their clothes to a laundromat, which has one where they can pay to use it. Indeed, hanging up your clothes to dry is really practically unheard of. Number 4. Drinks in the UK are very rarely served with ice, whereas in America it's expected. In the United States of America, you can bet that almost every drink you buy will be full of ice if it was meant to be cold in the first place. Beers are always served cold, though without ice, and it's a common American joke to make fun of people for drinking beer that isn't chilled to the bone. Many people would be honestly offended in America if their soda or other cold drink wasn't chock full of ice. In fact, the ice obsession is so crazy that some have even accused Starbucks of putting too much ice in their ice drinks and ripping people off. However, for most people it's a non-issue as they want the experience of it being cold and understand the laws of physics. However, in Great Britain, chilling every single drink and filling it full of ice is not nearly such a widespread practice. In fact, in the hospitality industry, where you would expect it to be common, ice is fairly rare. Most soda is served with little, if any, ice. This is partly because soda tends to be more expensive than in the USA, and they don't usually offer free refills, so people do not want to feel ripped off. In general, ice is not seen as all that important to the experience of drinking anything, nor is totally chilling it. Some beers are actually meant to be drunk at a reasonable temperature, and they don't need the bottles to have been chilled in ice or a refrigerator first. An American would find all of this pretty hard to understand, as proper temperature is something Americans tend to make a big deal about when eating or drinking, especially when paying for meals out. Number 3. In the USA, television programming is much more loud and boisterous. In the USA, television programming tends to be much more direct, sort of like how American comedy is much more direct as well. In general, Americans like their TV programs to constantly have some sort of drama going on. Commercial breaks will often set up a cliffhanger, even in cooking shows, and always have dramatic music to amp up the drama. Reality shows especially will go to great lengths to turn everything into the most insane thing that has ever happened, even if that moment just turned out to be people arguing over where to go for dinner or something pretty similar. However, TV in the UK tends to be much less in your face. It's typically more quiet and more subtle. A really good example of the contrast is the show Kitchen Nightmares, hosted by celebrity chef Gordon Ramsay. It's the same show and the same exact guy in both the United States and the UK versions, but despite having the same structure, they might as well be different shows altogether. The tone is completely different, and the way he approaches things on the two versions of the show could not be more night and day. On the UK version of Kitchen Nightmares, he is calm, reserved, and almost indirect while explaining things to people. The music is low-key, and the announcer sounds like he's hosting a nature documentary. On the other hand, the American version has dramatic cuts, intros and outros, with Gordon constantly yelling various insults. When Gordon talks to people on the American version, he's constantly yelling, swearing, and throwing insults, being incredibly direct to the point of being rude, and American audiences loved it. Ramsay fully understood the different audiences and tailored his show perfectly to match each one. Number 2. Americans are positive and idealistic. British people are more pessimistic, but down to earth. One stereotype about Americans that they might not find particularly negative, that is held by many in Europe, is that Americans are extremely positive. Europeans tend to be surprised at how Americans will always find the good in situations and always seem to think that things are going to get better and that eventually they will be extremely successful and have everything going for them. This is an attitude cultivated by the American entrepreneurial spirit where everyone believes they could be a millionaire. America was basically founded on runaway optimism, even when that optimism didn't really make any sense at all. On the other hand, British people tend to be much more pessimistic about the world and how things tend to work. They, on a whole, often have an attitude of believing that a lot of the bad things are simply bad and things may really not get that much better, and you probably have to settle for incremental change at best. However, this attitude should not be mistaken as entirely negative either. After a lot of hardship, British people have developed a strong, stiff upper lipness, an attitude to keep calm and carry on, even when trying situations make it difficult for anyone to cope with the situation itself. Born out of trials like World War II, they gained a quiet but dignified resolve and the ability to dryly make light of even the worst situations in order to keep up their spirits. Number 1. People in the UK are much less religious than those in the United States. The United States is known for being one of the more religious countries in the world, especially when compared to the UK. Gallup has long tracked the US numbers for how many people identify as various Christian denominations, how many people identify as other religions, and how many people are not religious at all. In the United States, roughly 75% of people identify as some sort of Christian, and about 5% identify as another type of religion. The other 20% are not necessarily full-blown atheists, but are not particularly religious either. These are rather high numbers and show that the vast majority of people in the United States believe in the Abrahamic religions to some extent or another, and it shows that faith is a big part of American life. Now, in the United Kingdom, faith is not nearly as important, and many people are simply not religious at all. In a recent survey of dozens of countries, it turns out that the UK ranked near the very bottom when it came to their religiosity. Only 35% of people actually identified as particularly religious at all, which is a tiny number compared to those in the United States. There are simply far fewer people in the UK who care as deeply about religion, and it's not an important part of daily life or culture. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also some videos from the archives over there on the right. And as always, thank you for watching.